I used to think the hardest part of growing up was the homework. I know, stupid. But when you're 16 and the worst thing on your schedule is a calculus midterm, it's easy to forget that the world you saved at 11 is still out there, breathing, changing, going wrong in ways that don't announce themselves until they're standing in front of you in the middle of a busy street with teeth bared and something wrong burning in their eyes. I'd had 3 years to get comfortable. 3 years to convince myself that the goggles hanging on my bedroom wall were a souvenir, not a tool. 3 years to be just Kamiya, soccer captain, mediocre student, person who slept through his alarm most mornings and argued with his sister about who ate the last of the cereal. 3 years is a long time when you're 17, long enough to believe the quiet. The quiet ended on a Tuesday. I remember the exact moment because I was supposed to be on the pitch in 4 minutes. We had a match against Shinonome, and I'd stayed late to retape my shin guards because the adhesive on the left one had given out during practice, and Coach Tanaka had already given me one look across the locker room that meant he was tracking my every move. I was walking out through the east gate of Tsukishima General, jersey still half untucked, when the phone started going off. Not one or two phones, every phone on the block all at once, that emergency broadcast tone that cuts through everything like a blade, the civil defense alert. The one they tested twice a year, and you always ignored because it was always a test. This wasn't a test. I heard it before I saw it, a sound like an industrial shredder eating a building, rhythmic and wet, something that had no business existing in a city of 13 million people. The air pressure changed. I felt it in my ears first, that drop stomach sensation you get when an elevator descends too fast, and then the screaming started from the direction of the harbor road, and I was already moving before I'd made any decision to move. That's the thing they don't tell you about being a diggy destined. After enough years, your legs remember what your brain hasn't caught up to yet. The Kyugaman was enormous. I'd fought them before, of course. When I was 11, the first one had come through a TV screen and landed on a beach in another world, and the 8 of us had screamed and run and eventually, miraculously, survived. This one came through something that wasn't a screen, it came through a tear in the fabric of the air itself, a rippling distortion above the elevated highway that pulsed like a bruise, and the Kyugaman that fell out of it was bigger than the ones I remembered. Heavier. The carapace was wrong, the normal red-brown of the species had gone dark, almost black, and the eyes were the color of infected tissue, a sickly luminescent yellow that had nothing calm or animal about it. This thing wasn't hunting. It wasn't following instinct. It was malfunctioning. Like a machine that someone had jammed a spike into and switched back on. It took out a pedestrian overpass with one swing of its horn. I had the Digivis in my pocket. I always had it, even now, even 3 years on. It was habit the way keys were habit, the way you never left the house without your phone. I didn't remember putting it there that morning. My hands found it before my conscious mind gave the instruction, and the moment my fingers closed around it, something on the other end of the connection woke up. I don't have a good word for what it feels like when Aguman comes back. Relief is too small, joy sounds too clean. It's more like a room you've been living in with one wall missing, 3 years of cold wind you'd stopped noticing, and then someone closes the wall and you feel the warmth and realize how cold you'd actually been. He came through a smaller distortion 50 meters down the road, orange and stubby, and completely unfazed by the screaming civilians parting around him like water around a stone. And he looked up at me with those eyes, that particular Aguman expression that manages to combine absolute confidence with absolute trust simultaneously, and said, "Tai, you look older." I said, "You look exactly the same." He said, "Don't worry about the details." And then Grayman was standing in the middle of odaiba, and the Kyugaman turned. I won't describe the next 14 minutes in detail because it wasn't clean. Grayman is strong, always has been, but the infected Kyugaman had something extra in it, a feverish overclock, like its pain tolerance had been removed along with whatever passed for its sanity. Grayman's Nova Blast hit it square, and it stumbled and kept coming. I was directing from the ground, which meant I was also dodging falling concrete, and somewhere in the chaos, a car alarm started and never stopped, providing the most absurd soundtrack to something genuinely terrifying. We drove it back toward Hainda. I hitched a ride I shouldn't have in a car driven by a man I didn't know, a tall, measured man in his early 40s who drove like someone who'd seen this kind of thing before, calm hands on the wheel, asking me questions about where the Digimon was headed in a tone of voice that was professional rather than panicked. I gave him the information. I didn't ask why he wanted it. I had other things to worry about. At the airport, more Kyuubimen came through. 3 of them, then 5. And then the other phones rang, my phone, my actual personal phone, and I picked it up to hear Matt's voice. And behind Matt's voice I could hear the others, and I felt something in my chest unlock that I hadn't realized was locked. They came from every direction. Matt with Gabuman already beside him, both of them wearing the same expression of contained urgency that had always been Matt's version of panic, everything under the surface, nothing on the face. Sora arrived running, Biyaman on her shoulder, and she'd grown her hair out, and I noticed that in the middle of a crisis, which says something about how the brain works. Joe was there, swearing quietly in the way Joe had always sworn when he was genuinely frightened, but trying to hold it together for everyone else's sake. Mimi came in from the direction of the terminal, incongruously perfect, and I never knew how she managed that, how she always looked like the chaos wasn't touching her even when she was the most scared of all of us. TK and Kari arrived together, which they almost always did now. The 2 youngest had always had a gravity between them, a sibling-shaped pull, and 3 years had only made it more obvious. 8 kids who saved the world at 11, 17 now, mostly, standing in an airport while Garuruman and Tojman and the others tore into infected Kyuubimen in the middle of the tarmac. We won that fight. We won it badly and loudly and with collateral damage I didn't want to count, but we won it. The Kyuubimen fell. The last one was pulled back through a distortion by something we didn't see, a hand, almost, a vast dark shape that withdrew before anyone could get a look at it, and then there was just the aftermath. Cracked runway concrete, a fuel truck on its side, miraculously unignited. My team standing in a rough circle, Digimon partners settling back to their smaller forms, everyone breathing hard and looking at each other with that specific mix of expression that doesn't have a name. We did it, and we shouldn't have had to, and we're glad we did. I told them what I was thinking, that we'd won but it hadn't felt like a win, that the collateral damage was real, and the people evacuating that terminal were real, and the overpass that had gone down on the highway was going to cost someone's insurance company a number I didn't want to think about. Matt told me I was overthinking it. Matt was wrong, but I didn't say so, because the expression on his face told me he was working through the same calculation and had just reached a different answer. The man who'd given me the ride, his name was Nishijima, Daigo Nishijima, turned out to be something more official than a concerned civilian. He worked for an organization monitoring anomalous Digimon activity. The infected Kyuubimen, he explained, were not random. The distortions they came through had been proliferating for weeks. Something was compromising the digital world's partition from the real one, and the Kyuubimen were symptoms, not causes. He was careful with his words, professional, the way people are when they've been briefed on how much to tell you, and are trying to honor that briefing while still being useful. I appreciated the effort even when I resented the withholding. I went home that night and sat in my room for a long time looking at the goggles. This is the part that's hard to explain to people who weren't there, who didn't carry the weight of the original battles. Digimon fights in the digital world are one thing. The stakes are enormous, but the arena is contained, and the rules of that world bend around the violence in ways the real world's rules don't. When we fought there, cities didn't lose overpasses. When we fought there, the collateral was abstract. suffered by a reality that could absorb and reset in ways Tokyo couldn't. Now we were fighting here. And the question I couldn't stop sitting with was, if we make things worse every time we try to make them better, are we actually helping? I went to sleep without an answer. The next week moved strangely. School kept happening, which felt surreal. The world had nearly come apart at the Hainda terminal, and here we were doing presentations on the Meiji Restoration and arguing about lunch. The others felt it too, that strange double-life vertigo, but we'd all had practice at it from years ago, and we fell back into the rhythm by default. Izzy, our resident genius, our information processor, the person who had always been 3 analytical steps ahead of everyone else, had his laptop open at every available moment, running through whatever sensor data Nishijima's organization was willing to share, and whatever he could pull from his own networks, trying to map the distortion pattern, trying to find the shape of the problem. He couldn't find it. That bothered him more than the problem itself. There was a new girl in my class. Her name was Meiko Machizuki, and she was the kind of new student who made herself small by instinct, not shy exactly, more like someone who'd learned early that taking up less space was safer. She sat 2 rows to my left, near the window, and she always had books on her desk even when class hadn't started yet, and she ate lunch alone the first 3 days before Sora noticed, and Sora being Sora started eating with her. She was from Tottori originally, had transferred when her family situation changed, and she had this quality of focused quiet that made you think she was paying more attention to the room than she let on. I didn't think much of it at first. New student, settling in, normal. I didn't notice the small orange shape in the shadows at the edge of the school roof, watching her. Our school organized a day trip to the Bay Resort, one of those half-hearted teacher-approved outings that nobody was excited about but everyone attended because the alternative was sitting through 2 more periods of chemistry. The whole class went. It was a good day, genuinely, clear sky, warm enough, the kind of afternoon that makes you believe for a few hours that nothing complicated exists. Matt and I had been circling around a disagreement we hadn't finished having, and one of our teachers decided the universe's idea of help was to put us in the same gondola on the resort's observation Ferris wheel, sealed in a small glass car 40 meters above the ground, no escape route. We argued. We didn't finish arguing. We almost started to finish arguing when Tai suddenly felt it, that pressure change, the same one from the airport but stronger this time, more concentrated. I looked up through the gondola glass and saw the sky doing something impossible. The distortion was the size of a city block. It pulsed in the air above the resort's central plaza like a wound that hadn't decided whether to close or open, and the emergency broadcast was already starting on every phone in the gondola. And below us, the crowds were beginning to move in that pre-panic way crowds move when they know something is wrong before they know what it is. We got out of the gondola before it finished its rotation. I don't recommend the methodology. The distortion opened. What came out was not a Kyugaman. What came out was something I had no information on, and that was new. I'd had years to build a working taxonomy of Digimon threat levels, and the part of my brain that ran that assessment went quiet in the first 3 seconds of looking at this thing, which was its own kind of answer. It was tall, armored in black that wasn't quite black, a chrome digizoid, the hardest material in either world, the kind of armor that made conventional attacks an abstract gesture. Humanoid in shape, carrying a sword longer than I was tall, moving with the slow, deliberate purpose of something that has never needed to hurry because nothing has ever successfully stopped it. No hesitation in the movement, no animal fear response. It came out of the distortion, and it immediately oriented, not at us, not at the Digimon, not at the largest threat in the area. It oriented toward the plaza's east corner, toward where a small orange shape had been darting through the shadows all afternoon. Toward where Meiko was running, calling a name I didn't recognize. Izzy looked at me with his laptop already open, trying to pull identification. He got a name and nothing else. Alphaman. No files, no historical data, no battle record he could access. Just the name hanging there in the record like a locked door. What I knew just from watching it move. This was not an infected Digimon. The Kyuugaman had been sick, corrupted, malfunctioning. This thing was the opposite, perfectly controlled, laser-focused, hunting with the kind of surgical intentionality that made it more frightening than anything feverish and chaotic. It wasn't broken. It was operating exactly as designed, and it had come through a dimensional rift specifically to find the small orange Digimon that was now pressed against Mako's chest, while she backed against the wall of the resort's main building, and looked at this armored impossibility with the expression of someone who had never stopped being afraid of the moment that just arrived. The partner Digimon went first. Garuruman, Tojman, Berdraman, Anjaman, Gadaman. They hit it in a coordinated burst, everything they had champion-level attacks that would have stopped anything reasonable. Alphaman absorbed them the way a stone wall absorbs rain. One sustained gesture of its hand scattered 3 of them simultaneously. Garuruman hit it from behind, jaws closing on the armor, and got thrown 20 meters sideways with an ease that wasn't even contemptuous. It was just physics, the kind that didn't require emotion. I had Aguman at my side, and I wasn't giving the order. I knew I wasn't giving it. I could feel Matt looking at me from across the plaza, and I could feel the look without seeing his face, that specific Matt issued a frequency of, "Tai, now is the moment, stop thinking and act." And I couldn't, because the airport was still in my head. The overpass was still in my head. The fuel truck on its side, the screaming evacuation, the number I hadn't let myself count. We were here in the middle of a resort, with civilians running in every direction. And the math of firing our biggest weapons in a space this crowded was not math I could just dismiss because the moment was urgent. It's easier to be brave when the fear is for yourself. When the fear is for the people beside you who didn't sign up for any of this, who didn't get Digivices at age 11 and don't have partners, and were just trying to have a normal Tuesday. That's a different fear, and it doesn't respond to the usual courage. It sits in the chest like a stone, and you keep looking at it and asking yourself if you're a coward or a responsible person, and the answer keeps changing depending on which angle you're looking from. Matt came through the chaos to reach me. He was still running, still tracking the fight over his shoulder, his voice controlled the way it always was under pressure. Matt had always been the one who sounded calmer the worse things got, and you could measure the severity of a situation by how quiet his voice became. "We're the only ones who can stop it," he said, not angry, not yet. "If we fire at full power in a crowd this size. If we don't fire, that crowd gets destroyed anyway. The thing is right there, Tai. It is tearing through everything we have, and it is going to reach Mako, and when it does, what? We let that happen because we were worried about the collateral." I said something about responsibility. He said something about cowardice wearing responsibility's mask. We'd had versions of this argument before, in other contexts, and the old version of it had always ended with me acting eventually, because that was what leaders did. But this time, the argument had a different weight. This time I could see Mako against the wall, and I could see Mekuman in her arms, the small orange Digimon, wide-eyed, clearly powerful in some way that Alphaman recognized and we didn't yet. And I could see in Mako's face something I recognized from 11 years old, from the first day in a world that made no sense with something enormous trying to kill me. She was terrified. She was completely alone with it, and nobody who was supposed to protect her was there. Whatever guardian she'd had, whatever system was meant to have registered her as a Digi destined, brought her into the network, made sure she wasn't isolated with her partner in a world that was starting to crack at the seams. None of it had worked. She'd been out here by herself, carrying Mekuman through a city that was starting to see distortions, with no contact from Nishijima's organization, no contact from us, no information about what was coming. Just a girl and her partner, and a threat neither of them understood, moving alone through a Tokyo that had no framework for what they were. I thought about my first day in the other world. I thought about Sora finding me when I was lost. I thought about Matt pulling me back from something stupid more times than I could count. I thought about what it would have been like to go through all of it without any of them. I gave the order. Agumon moved. War Grayman stood in the plaza, and even Alphaman paused, a single second of recalibration, something in its processing noting the threat reclassification, and War Grayman's Draman destroyers hit the chrome Digizoid with the first sound I'd heard make an impact. Not enough to stop it, but enough. Enough to buy Matt the seconds to reach Metal Gararuman's location, enough to give the signal, enough for the two of them to do what they'd done before, and what nothing else in either world could do. The light of the DNA digivolution is something you feel before you see it. It starts behind the eyes, a warmth that has no physical source, and by the time it's visible it's already overwhelming, two massive forms of energy collapsing into each other and then expanding outward as something new, something that shouldn't exist by the rules of either world but does anyway, assembled from two human bonds instead of one. Omniman, white armor, one cannon, one sword. Eyes that looked at Alphaman with the calm of something that had also never needed to hurry, but for different reasons. The plaza cleared fast. People run from big things. That's one human behavior that hasn't needed updating. They fought. I'm going to be direct about the nature of that fight. It was not a clean win. It was never going to be a clean win because what we were dealing with was not an opponent we fully understood, fighting for reasons we couldn't fully read, with capabilities we had no complete measure of. Omniman pressed hard. Alphaman adapted. Alphaman drew its Aryuken. The sword extended, the armor shifted, and what had been a one-sided assessment became a genuine even match. Two engines of devastation working at the outer limit of what each of them could do, and the plaza shook with it, and I directed from the ground and tried not to think about the buildings. Alphaman drove its weapon into the ground. A binding technique, something anchored in the stone of the plaza that held Aryuken in place for 3 seconds, maybe 4. 3 seconds was enough. Omniman charged the cannon. I saw it building, the Terra Force energy gathering at the muzzle, white-hot and absolute, the kind of attack that ended arguments rather than winning them. Alphaman wrenched free. Alphaman stepped back into a distortion that opened behind it like a curtain, like it had always been there, like the dimensional membrane in this part of the city had been kept open as an exit option the entire time. The blast went through where it had been standing and kept going until it hit nothing, because what it was aimed at had already left. The distortion closed. The plaza was quiet in the way places are quiet after something enormous has just vacated them. A held-breath silence, full of the residue of violence and the strange relief of survival. I stood in the middle of it and did the count I hadn't let myself do at the airport. Buildings damaged, vehicles destroyed, infrastructure that was going to cost. The number was real and it didn't go away just because we'd won. It sat with me, and I knew it was going to keep sitting with me because that was the deal I'd made when I gave the order. You choose to act, you own the consequences of the action. That's not absolution. It's just reality. But Mako was standing. That was the part I came back to when the counting got too heavy. Mako and Mekuman were standing at the edge of the plaza, and Mekuman was still making the small, uncertain sounds that Agumon had sometimes made when he was just a rookie, and didn't know whether the current situation called for bravery or retreat, and Mako was looking at all of us. 8 kids she'd been sitting near in class for a week, 2 of them in the process of returning their Digimon to smaller forms, all of us still breathing hard, with an expression that was working its way through about 14 different emotions simultaneously. Sora reached her first. Sora always did. She didn't say anything complicated. She just walked over and stood beside Mako and put a hand on her arm, and that was enough to start the shift in Mako's expression from whatever braced for impact thing had been doing towards something more like relief. Mekumen pressed her nose into the crook of Mako's elbow, and Mako held her tighter, and Mekumen's small sounds quieted. We sat with her for a while before anyone asked questions. That was the right call. Sometimes the most important thing you do in the aftermath of something terrible is just be present without needing anything from the person who went through it. Kari was good at that. TK was good at that. Even Joe, who was still running a mental triage of his own anxiety, sat down on a broken piece of plaza railing and said nothing useful and nothing harmful, which is its own kind of help. Mako told us eventually. Her name was Mako Machizuki. She'd had Mekumen for years. The partnership had formed into Tori privately, without any network connection, without any organization knowing about it, without any of the infrastructure that was supposed to surround a Digi destined reaching her. Mekumen had come through a distortion that was smaller than the current ones, smaller and more localized, and had followed Mako home, and Mako had kept her hidden because she hadn't known what else to do. She'd known about Digimon in the abstract. Everyone in Japan knew about Digimon 3 years after Odaiba, after the event that was still referred to in certain government reports as the anomalous entity incident. But she hadn't known that what she had was the same thing, hadn't known there were others, hadn't had a way to find out. She'd been protecting Mekumen alone for 2 years, feeding her, hiding her, moving her when necessary, staying close to her when the city's distortions got worse and Mekumen got frightened. She transferred schools not for family reasons, but because the distortion near her old school had been getting larger and she'd thought the distance would help. It hadn't helped. Alphaman had found them anyway. "Why is it after Mekumen?" Izzy asked, and he asked it gently, which I noticed because Izzy's default mode was efficient rather than gentle. Mako didn't know. Mekumen didn't know, or couldn't explain what she knew, or knew in a way that didn't translate into language we could parse. She pressed closer to Mako and made a sound that might have been an answer, and might have been just an expression of existing near something that had tried to kill her. "It doesn't matter why right now," I said. "Right now what matters is that you're not alone with it anymore." I don't know if that was the right thing to say. I don't have a perfect record on saying the right thing. But Mako looked at me when I said it, and whatever had been braced in her expression since we'd sat down shifted a fraction, and she nodded slowly like someone testing whether the ground under a new understanding was solid enough to stand on. Nishijima found us 40 minutes later. He'd been tracking the distortion signature from Alphaman's arrival and had vectored to the site. He came in from the north entrance of the resort and stopped when he saw our group, all 9 of us now, Digimon partners settled in various states of quiet around the edges of the gathering. He looked at Mako. He looked at Mekumen. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite surprise. "You found her," he said. "She found herself," Sora said, and there was a specific edge in Sora's voice that meant she'd already decided how much she liked this particular adult, and the answer was not much. Nishijima let that land without defending himself, which was the smart play. He sat down in the plaza with us and was more forthcoming than he'd been at the airport. The organization he worked for, he gave us a name, a department number, an institutional affiliation I didn't fully parse, had been monitoring Digi-destined signals for years, and had flagged Mako's as anomalous, a signature without a node, a Digivis signal that didn't connect to the network they'd built. They'd been trying to locate her. They hadn't been fast enough. He said it plainly, without making it sound like bureaucratic excuse, and I respected him more for the plainness. "What's happening to the digital world?" Matt asked. "We don't know the full picture yet," Nishijima said. "The infected Digimon, the Kyuugamon you encountered at the airport, and others we've been tracking, they're coming through distortions that are increasing in frequency. The infection appears to be spreading, but we haven't identified the source. Alphaman's involvement complicates the picture significantly." "Because Alphaman is a royal knight," Izzy said. Nishijima looked at him. Where did you get that? The name is in our taxonomy files. 12 royal knights, the most powerful class of Digimon in existence, sworn to protect the digital world's order. If one of them is operating in the real world, hunting a specific Digi-Destin's partner, then something is wrong at a level we haven't mapped yet, Nishijima finished. The afternoon had gone gold by the time we broke up the gathering, that particular late-summer Tokyo gold that makes even concrete look warm, the kind of light that lies to you about how hard everything is. Meiko had stopped shaking somewhere in the middle of Nishijima's briefing. Meikuman had fallen asleep against her leg, small and improbably peaceful, orange fur rising and falling with breath. I walked with Meiko to the resort's bus stop. The others were behind us, in smaller clusters, doing the post-crisis recalibration that had always been part of our process, even when we'd been 11 and hadn't had a name for it. Aguman padded beside me, small again, hands behind his back with the easy contentment of a creature that had just done something hard and come through it intact. You didn't have to step in, Meiko said. Yes, I did. I mean, she stopped, tried again. I didn't expect anyone to. I've been handling this alone for a long time and I stopped expecting backup. I thought about what to say to that. I thought about 11-year-old me, first day in a world that was trying to kill me, and the specific terror of believing that no one was coming, and the way that belief had calcified into something that might have become permanent if a particular girl with red hair hadn't sat beside me in the dark and refused to leave. The thing about backup, I said, is that it tends to show up late. That's not an excuse. It's just how it usually works. It shows up late and you've already had to handle more than you should have handled alone, and that's real and it's not fair, but it showed up. Meiko was quiet for a few steps. Meikuman likes you, she said. She's usually wary of new people. Aguman made a sound of dignified satisfaction. Tell her she has good taste, I said. Meiko almost smiled. Almost. The edges of it were there, the muscle movement around her mouth that precedes a smile, and then she caught it and held it back the way people do when they're not ready to be okay yet, but they can see in the distance that okay might eventually be possible. I didn't push it. The bus came. We got on. The city moved past the windows in its evening mode, lit up and dense and completely indifferent to the fact that a black-armored knight from another dimension had just fought an angelic fusion of two legendary Digimon in a resort plaza while tourists scattered like startled birds. Tokyo has a capacity for that kind of indifference. You don't know whether to admire it or be disturbed by it. I thought about the fight on the way home. Specifically, I thought about the moment I'd made the decision, the moment the stone had shifted, and I'd given Aguman the order to move. I'd been trying to identify exactly what had moved it, what had broken the paralysis. It wasn't that I'd stopped being afraid of the collateral. I was still afraid of it. I was going to keep being afraid of it because the fear was correct. The collateral was real, and people who ignore correct fears tend to make bad decisions. But I'd understood something, sitting in that plaza watching Meiko against the wall, that the fear of causing harm was running alongside a different fear, and the second fear was worse. The fear of watching someone else absorb all the harm, while I stood there calculating. Doing nothing is also a choice. The damage from doing nothing is also real. You don't get to decline participation in a situation and then wash your hands of its outcome. If Alphaman had reached Meiko, if she'd been hurt, if Meikuman had been taken, the fact that no collateral was created by our inaction wouldn't have made it a better outcome. It would have been a different kind of damage, and the people who suffered it would have suffered it while I stood at a careful distance doing math. Matt was right. I told him he was wrong and he was right. I'd tell him eventually, not tonight. Tonight required a certain amount of sitting alone with the calculus of what I'd chosen and what it had cost and whether the ledger came out on the right side. It mostly did, I thought. But mostly wasn't the same as cleanly, and I'd learned a long time ago not to flatten the difference. Kari was awake when I got home. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her school books open and her tea cold, and that expression she had when she'd been waiting to see if I came home in one piece. She looked me over, the way she'd always done, systematic, quick, checking for injury, with a competence that was impressive in anyone and remarkable in someone who'd learned it before she was 10. "I heard about the resort," she said. "I figured. TK texted me. He texts you a lot." "Tai." "I know." She poured me tea that she'd already gotten out of the cabinet and set by the kettle before I walked in, because Kari had always been 3 emotional steps ahead of the conversation. I sat down. The tea was wrong, I'd asked for green, and she'd made the mild breakfast blend because she knew my stomach went bad after a fight, and it was exactly right. "There's a new girl," I said. "Her name is Mako. She's been doing this alone." Kari was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 2 years. She processed that. Her expression did something complicated that she kept contained, but I knew my sister. "She's okay." "She's going to be okay." "Because of you." "Because of all of us. I figured out what I was supposed to do a little later than I should have." Kari picked up her tea, set it down. "That's different from not figuring it out." "Yeah. Dad used to say the most dangerous thing you can do is be so afraid of making a mistake that you stop moving." Dad also once locked his keys in the car with the engine running. "He's human," Kari said. "So are you." I went asleep with that. It's not a complicated thought, so are you, but it covers a lot of ground if you let it. Humans make bad calculations. Humans hesitate when they shouldn't and act when they should wait, and sometimes get the timing completely wrong and still come through the other side having done something that mattered. That's not a bug in the design. It might be the whole point. The distortions didn't stop after the resort. Nishijima's organization tracked 3 more in the following week, smaller ones, further from the populated center, and the infected Digimon that came through them were intercepted before they reached civilian areas. We weren't told the details, but we were told the number, which was Nishijima's way of keeping us informed without making us responsible for information we couldn't act on. It was a reasonable way to manage the situation. I didn't love it, but I understood it. Mako started eating lunch with the group. Not forced, not organized. Sora simply made the opening and Mako walked through it. And then she was just there, at the corner table with her lunch and her books, and Meicoomon in a bag under her chair making sounds that Agumon, sitting at my feet, answered in kind. The 2 Digimon had established some kind of preliminary accord. I didn't know the terms. I don't think they'd been negotiated in any language I could access. What I knew was that Meicoomon ate the sandwich I offered her on the 3rd day, and that was apparently a significant thing, because Mako looked up when it happened with an expression I can only describe as surprised relief. The specific expression of someone who'd been braced for rejection and gotten acceptance instead, and isn't sure yet how much to trust it. "She doesn't usually," Mako started. "Agumon wouldn't eat out of anyone's hand for about 3 weeks after we first met," I said. "Then he ate half of Matt's lunch without being offered it, and we decided he'd settled in." Agumon looked up with the studied innocence of someone who has been unfairly maligned, and is too dignified to respond. I started to understand over those days what Mako's 2 years alone had actually looked like. Not from anything she said directly. She wasn't, by nature, a direct talker. She came at things sideways in small pieces, the way you share information when you've learned that sharing too much too fast tends to cost you something. But the pieces accumulated. The nights she'd spent with Meicoomon hidden under her bed, because there'd been a distortion near the apartment, and she hadn't known if Alphamon or something like it would come through. The days she'd spent in class watching her phone for alerts that might mean she needed to get home and move Meicoomon before whoever lived in the apartment below noticed the sounds. The specific loneliness of having something extraordinary in your life and no one you could tell. I knew that loneliness. I'd been 11 when I first met it. She'd had 2 more years. "You could have come to us," I said once. "I didn't know about you," she said. "I mean, I knew about the Odaiba incident. Everyone knows. But I didn't know there were others still active, and I didn't know how to find them, and I didn't want to if I approached the wrong people, if someone official got involved who wasn't." She trailed off, found the end of the sentence. "Safe." "Yeah," I said. "That's reasonable. I know it looks like I should have found a way sooner. It looks like you did what you could with what you had. That's the only measure that matters." She looked at me for a moment, and I had the sense she was running some internal assessment of whether I meant it, checking the words for the particular hollowness of things people say to make you feel better without actually believing them. Whatever she found, it passed the check. "Meikuman likes your argument," she said. "He grows on people," I said, "and Digimon apparently." Argument made a sound that was definitely agreement. The question of what Alphaman wanted, why a royal knight of the digital world had come through a dimensional rift to target a rookie Digimon and her 17-year-old partner, was one Izzy kept working on, with the focused anxiety of someone who couldn't stop pulling a thread. Nishijima's organization was working the same question from their end, with more resources and less access than Izzy had to certain data streams. The two of them had established a productive, slightly competitive information-sharing arrangement that both of them would have denied was competitive if you'd called it that. What they had at the end of 2 more weeks, not enough. The distortion pattern was real and growing. The infection spreading through certain Digimon populations in the digital world was real, and its vector was unidentified. Alphaman's involvement suggested something operating at a level of digital world politics that was either above the current crisis or central to it in ways that weren't visible yet. Meikuman was a factor in the equation whose value remained unknown. These were the things we lived with. Diggy destined adjacent, the girl who'd been doing this alone for 2 years. We lived with the unknowns and kept going. That's not heroism. It's just what you do when the alternative is stopping. Mako slowly stopped being braced. It happened the way most important things happen, not in a single moment but in accumulation, a series of small, unremarkable instances that added up to a change of state. She started arriving at the lunch table before we did. She started texting in the group chat. She started laughing at things, real laughter rather than polite laughter, the kind that catches you before you've decided to laugh and means you've actually found something funny rather than socially navigating the expectation of finding it funny. Meikuman started spending less time in the bag and more time visible, in situations where visibility was safe, pressed against Mako's leg with the air of a creature who had identified the perimeter of her world and found it acceptable. Joe told me once quietly that watching Mako settle in reminded him of watching Tai at 11, the careful version of Tai, the one who existed before Tai had decided the world was survivable. I didn't know what to do with the comparison. I thought about it for a long time. Argument told me I thought too much. He said this in the tone of voice that was fond rather than critical, which was the only way he said things like that. "Maybe," I said. "Definitely," he said, "but you always figure it out eventually. That's what you do." I waited too long at the resort. "You were working through something hard." Matt almost had to drag me. "Matt was also scared," Argument said. "He just scares differently than you. Yours shows on the outside, his goes in. Neither of you was wrong. You both got there." I had nothing useful to say to that, which was a sign it was probably true. The fall term settled into its shape. School practice, the low-grade vigilance that was now the permanent background texture of our lives, monitoring the distortion reports, keeping our phones charged, running through the informal protocols we developed for rapid assembly if something came through again. Nishijima checked in twice a week. Izzy updated his tracking models. Mako came to practice once and watched, sitting in the bleachers with Mekuman asleep in her lap. And when I scored in the scrimmage, she made the specific expression of someone who is trying not to look impressed and failing. I didn't say anything about it. I'm working on being less insufferable about these things. The night before the term's first major exam, I sat on the roof of our building with Aguman and watched the Tokyo skyline and thought about continuity. About how the world at 11 had been one kind of impossible, and the world at 17 was a different kind, and the gap between them wasn't as large as it looked from inside it. About Mako, 2 years alone in an apartment in Totori with an orange Digimon under her bed, surviving something that shouldn't have been survivable alone, and how she'd done it, and what that said about the specific architecture of certain kinds of people. About Alphaman, still out there, still oriented towards something we didn't fully understand. About the distortions, increasing in frequency, pointing towards something wrong at a depth we hadn't reached yet. It's going to get worse before it gets better, I said. Probably, Aguman said. You're not worried. He thought about it with the particular seriousness he brought to things that deserved serious treatment. I'm here, he said. You're here. The others are here. Mako and Mekuman are here now, which they weren't before, and that means we know something we didn't. Things usually get harder before they get better. That doesn't mean they don't get better. I looked at the skyline, the lights of the city, 13 million people who were living their lives tonight without knowing about the fault lines opening in the boundaries between their world and another one, without knowing that a group of 17-year-olds with ridiculous partner creatures were the thing standing in the gap. It had always been true. It was true before I knew it was true, when I was 11 and thought a camping trip was the plan. It would be true tomorrow. Okay, I said. Okay, Aguman agreed. We sat there until the curfew lights came on in the apartment below, and then we went in, because tomorrow was a school day and I had calculus to fail, and the world could hold its crises for 8 more hours while I slept. That was the deal. You carry what you can carry, you rest when you have to rest, and you trust that the people on either side of you are doing the same. Mako sent a message in the group chat at 11:13 that night. It was 2 words and a small image, a photo of Mekuman asleep on her pillow with her paw over her face. Good night, the message said. 14 people responded within 4 minutes. Kari with a small heart, Matt with a thumbs up, which was the maximum warmth Matt expressed over text, Joe with a detailed response about how Mekuman's sleeping position was consistent with optimal temperature regulation in smaller Digimon, which nobody asked for and everybody appreciated. Aguman apparently had Sora's old phone and sent a blurry close-up of the ceiling. I typed mine last. Sleep well, we've got it from here. I meant it the way I hadn't meant anything simple in a long time. Not as a promise about specific outcomes. The future was too uncertain for specific promises, and the thing about being a Digi destined at 17 was that you'd had enough experience to know that outcomes weren't guaranteed, and the certainty people sometimes look for in each other isn't something anyone can honestly provide. I meant it as something more fundamental than that. As a statement of fact about the present tense, the group existed. The gap that had surrounded Mako for 2 years existed no longer. Whatever came next, she would move through it surrounded rather than alone. That was worth something. That was worth a lot. The goggles were still on my bedroom wall when I got back inside. I looked at them for a moment before I turned off the light. They didn't look like a souvenir anymore. They hadn't for a while, probably. I'd just been taking a long time to admit it. I turned off the light and went to sleep, and the city held its breath outside the window, full of distortions it hadn't learned to name yet, and somewhere across town, a new Digi destined held a sleeping Mekuman and trusted, for the first time in 2 years, that she could let the night be just a night. We'd figure out the rest in the morning. We always did. The first week after the resort had its own particular texture. Not the texture of a crisis ongoing, more like the texture of a crisis that had passed through and left its marks on everything it touched. The way a storm leaves the air changed even after the clouds go. Nishijima called a meeting at a location that wasn't a school or a resort or any of the places we'd been using as improvised gathering points. An actual room in an actual building with a projector and chairs and coffee that was better than it had any right to be in a government-adjacent facility. He brought a colleague who was introduced and then mostly stayed quiet. A woman named Himekawa, dark-suited, the kind of professional stillness that either means someone is very calm or very careful, and I couldn't tell which in the one meeting we had. They showed us distortion maps. The pattern was worse than what Nishijima had communicated in the informal check-ins. The proliferation wasn't linear, it was accelerating, a progression that, if extended even a few months, would produce distortions in frequency and size that the current management protocols couldn't handle quietly. The infected Digimon were still a symptom, but the symptom was getting louder. Mako sat 2 seats from me and listened and asked good questions, precise ones, the kind that came from 2 years of thinking hard about something without anyone to think alongside. Himekawa answered them with the careful precision of someone respecting a question that deserved to be taken seriously. Izzy was taking notes at a rate that suggested his fingers were doing the thinking while his brain processed the information above. Matt asked the question nobody else had put directly. What did they want from us? Nishijima said what they'd always wanted, what the organization existed to provide, more or less. The ability to respond when the distortions produced something the standard suppression apparatus couldn't handle. They weren't asking us to be soldiers. They weren't asking us to abandon our lives. They were asking us to be available, which we'd effectively been anyway, and to share information, which Izzy had effectively been doing anyway. That's what we were doing before we knew you existed, Matt said. Yes, Nishijima said. It's tidier with coordination. It was, probably. We agreed provisionally to the coordination. Some of the others had reservations I won't go into because they were theirs to have and share as they chose. My reservation was simpler, and I said it plainly. I needed to know that Mako and Mekumen were in the same information loop as the rest of us. No separation between the original 8 and the newest 9th. Same briefings, same access. Nishijima looked at Himekawa. Something passed between them, a very small thing, a flicker, the kind of exchange that contains a whole prior conversation, and then he said yes. Himekawa took a photograph of Mako and Mekumen on their way out. I noticed, I didn't say anything, I filed it. Some things you notice and file. You don't always know why until later. The story of that fall, the shape of it, the weight of it, is a story I'm still inside in ways. I can tell the beginning of it. The Kyuugaman on the highway, Aguman walking back into my life through a tear in the air, a girl alone in a plaza with a small orange Digimon and a black knight hunting her. I can tell the moment it changed, my paralysis breaking and the order given and the cost accepted. I can tell the aftermath, 8 becoming 9, a group chat at 11 at night, someone who'd been alone for 2 years learning what it felt like not to be. The rest of it is ongoing. The distortions don't stop because we named the problem. Alphaman doesn't disappear because we drove it back. Whatever is wrong in the digital world's deep structure, whatever is spreading through Digimon populations in ways that produce Kyuugaman with infected eyes and draw royal knights through dimensional membranes on specific hunting trajectories. That doesn't resolve because one afternoon in a resort plaza we got our act together and summoned Omniman. But that's fine. That's the deal. You don't sign up for complete resolution. You sign up for showing up, staying present, making the call when the call needs to be made. You sign up for accepting the calculus of action over inaction and carrying the cost of both and choosing, each time, which cost you can live with. I can live with the overpass. I can live with the cracked tarmac at Hainda and the resort plaza and the fuel truck on its side. I can't live with the alternative. Mako was at practice on a Wednesday 2 weeks later, bleachers again, Mekuman awake this time and watching with an attention that was almost forensic, tracking the ball with her head in that particular Digimon way that suggests the processing happening behind the eyes is considerably more sophisticated than the posture implies. I scored twice in the scrimmage. The second one was a good goal, nothing flashy, just well placed, the kind that comes from reading the field correctly rather than from individual speed or power. Mekuman made a sound when the second one went in, a sound I hadn't heard her make before, quiet, specific, unmistakably approving. Mako looked at her, then at me, then at her shoes, then back up with the edge of a smile finally making it all the way to her face. Some things take the time they take. That's the version of patience worth having, not waiting passively for things to fix themselves, but staying in the work while the results develop, trusting the process rather than the timeline. I'd learned it from Agumon mostly, who had always had it in a form that looked effortless because he'd never been constructed around the anxiety of outcomes. He cared about the doing. The done took care of itself. It wasn't a bad model. The semester exam came, and I failed calculus the way I'd expected to, and survived it the way I'd expected to. Kari tutored me with the patient resignation of someone who knows the subject will not get easier, and the student will not get worse. Matt sent a message that was technically sympathy and actually competitive, because that was Matt's love language and had been since we were 7. Sora sent actual sympathy, unconditional and warm, the kind that doesn't ask whether you studied enough because the question is beside the point. Mako sent a small voice memo of Mekuman, making the approving sound from the soccer field, apparently on the theory that positive reinforcement was transferable between domains. I listened to it 3 times. The goggles stayed on the wall, not as a souvenir, as equipment. The difference mattered and I'd finally gotten clear on it. We were ready for whatever came next. That was all, that was enough.